paid or bribed to do this. Is that what you had heard?
That is what I have heard.
And that is hearsay, of course. It's from somebody such as Pedro or Hernando, or who is your source of that information?
Basically, it was Carlos.
Did Carlos give you any idea of what it cost to get an illegal visa? What the price of this was?
In the case of the cartels, because there are various visas, the price 3 years ago was $5,000.
Do you have any reason to know if it occurs in other countries? In other words, is there other countries besides Colombia where somebody could pay and buy a fraudulent visa from a U.S. embassy?
I really have not heard anything like that.
Okay. Was this a pretty common thing from what you heard from Carlos?
This, they say, happens in special cases.
All right. You referred to the Medellin group as a federation. What is the interrelationship of the drug groups or cartels that make up the federation? Are there relationships between the Medellin Cartel and the Cali Cartel? Can you just describe how a group becomes associated with a federation and what it's like?
At that time, from the comments I heard from Carlos and Alberto, as a group, they could enter into transactions with Cali or with any other city, depending on the capability that they might have for transporting merchandise, which is the main purpose in these alliances, these pools.
Could you describe for us how you understand the drug cartels over the years have managed to corrupt the Colombian institutions, the government institutions, the political institutions, the financial institutions? This is only a personal opinion, Congressman. From what I have seen, it would be carried out this way. Generally, the drug cartels or the people within the drug cartels have started legitimate businesses. And to be able to start a legitimate operation with drug money, they have found it necessary to pay off many people within the institutions, the agencies. And these payoffs are made very often, very commonly. And therefore, the officers in these various institutions have become accustomed to this type of transaction. Could you tell us about the relationship between the drug cartels and the Colombian military intelligence? I'm particularly interested because I recall you told us that Carlos, the New York City branch head who you worked for, was a former Colombian intelligence person. I assume you mean Army intelligence. And I'm curious to know what the relationship is between drug cartels generally and military intelligence in Colombia, and how it is that former military intelligence officers work for the cartels, if in fact that's so.
Okay.
Obviamente los carteles los
Obviously,
carteles de la droga
the drug cartels
están muy interesados
are very interested
en personas que son
in
especializadas en el
individuals
manejo de armas,
who have specialized in the handling of weapons,
el manejo de armas
in
operaciones de seguridad,
in security operations,
en operaciones de espionaje
in spy operations,
y obviamente también en
and
consecución de
obviously also in the obtaining of information.
información. Entonces estos oficiales de
So
inteligencia
these intelligence officers
son perfectos para
are
este grupo.
ideal for this type of group
Y
And
entonces debido a los pagos que reciben
because of the payments they receive,
tan bajos
which
por sus servicios los militares,
which
por
is
sus
very,
salarios.
very low, meaning their salaries as military personnel are very low.
Son ampliamente superados por las ofertas que
And
hacen los carteles.
certainly the offers made to them by the cartels are way above what they could make.
Normalmente estas
Normally,
personas,
these people
empiezan como personal de seguridad
set out
con los carteles
as security personnel for the cartels,
y posteriormente
and then
van avanzando
as time goes
de
on,
acuerdo a sus capacidades.
they progress depending on their capabilities.
Well, I thank you very much for your
Muchas
description. I
gracias por
have
su
taken up my 10
descripción.
minutes, and I will yield to Mr. Hutchinson for 10 minutes for any questions he may have. Mr. Hutchinson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to look more closely at the New York City branch of the operations that you have described, and you talked about the corruption in Colombia and the different institutions there. Could you elaborate on the importance of corrupting the law enforcement officials in New York City and how that is accomplished, if it is?
Yo realmente no conozco de corrupción
I really
de autoridades
do not know anything about direct corruption of the authorities
en New York.
in New York City.
Yo lo que conozco,
What I do know,
lo que he visto y
what I
escuchado,
have seen and what I have heard,
es que hay instituciones
is
como motores y vehículos,
that there are agencies like motor vehicle,
las
uh,
cuales reciben dineros por estas
where people are receiving monies for
licencias, este tipo de
driver's
cosas.
licenses and that type of thing.
Pero no he
But
escuchado
I have not heard
acerca de corrupción en
about corruption
instituciones.
in other institutions in New York City.
You were the deputy for Carlos, who is chief of the New York City branch. Does that mean that Carlos did not engage in corruption efforts of the New York City Police Department?
No.
No, he did not. He did not try to.
And am I correct that Carlos was in charge of the New York City branch?
Carlos era el encargado de la sucursal de la ciudad de Nueva York.
Sí.
Yes.
And so if it was happening, it would be happening either from someone outside of, maybe more closely connected with the Colombian headquarters?
Más ligada, más directamente con la oficina central en Colombia.
Yo no creo que ellos ellos estén efectuando
I
ese tipo de
do not believe that they
ese tipo de
are
corrupción en los Estados
engaging in that type of corruption here in the United States.
Now, you indicated what you had heard. I mean,
Ahora
is,
me dice usted lo que ha oído.
do you have information that maybe is not personal to you that corruption is taking place?
No sea por conocimiento personal, pero sabe usted que esté sucediendo.
Las personas dicen muchas cosas. ¿verdad?
People talk and they say a lot of things,
especialmente para tratar de
more
conseguir
particularly if they're
lo que
trying
llamamos contratos.
to get what we call contracts.
Pero
But
realmente en ningún momento lo he podido
I have really
comprobar.
not been able to confirm this at any time.
Let me move on here. I don't want you to say anything that would give information as to your identity, and so if you want to be careful, that's understandable. But you obviously have an education. Were you motivated into the drug cartel because of money?
Por dinero.
Entré al cartel por dinero, por problemas
I got
de dinero.
involved in the cartel for money, yes, because of money problems.
In reference to you, but also the other people who will be working in the organization of the cartel, are they drug users themselves?
Ellos mismos usan droga.
Generalmente no usan.
Generally, they do not use drugs.
So it's a business
O
approach.
sea que es nada más una cuestión de negocio.
Correcto.
That is correct.
Did you ever give any thought to the young people who are being harmed by the cocaine that is filling the streets of New York City and our other areas?
Muchas veces.
Very frequently, yes.
During the time that you're engaged in those operations?
Cuando usted mismo estaba mezclado en esas operaciones,
Claro.
¿lo pensaba? Of course I did.
But you went ahead anyway because of the
Sin embargo,
financial
siguió
incentive?
adelante por el incentivo económico.
Habían varios motivos.
There were several reasons.
Uno de los motivos principales
One of the main reasons
fue el pago del secuestro de un hermano que
paying for the kidnapping of my brother.
y debía entrar y
And
ejecutar algunas de estas funciones
I had to fulfill certain of these tasks
para poder obtener
in order to be able to obtain
estos dineros y poderlos liberar.
the money for his release.
And that was carried out by the security people in Colombia.
Era esta gente de la seguridad en Colombia la que efectuó eso.
Sí, eran autoridades policiales.
Yes, these were police officials.
When you expressed your concern about law enforcement and
Expresa usted
you have to watch out that they don't
en que hay que
interfere
tener
with a
cuidado
shipment,
que
and then
las
also you were
autoridades
concerned about other drug dealers intercepting a shipment. Where was your greatest concern? From law enforcement intercepting a shipment or from other drug dealers?
Las autoridades,
The
con las autoridades hay un riesgo.
authorities,
Con las
there is a certain risk with the authorities,
especialmente con las autoridades
more
centrales,
particularly with the centralized authorities,
o sea, las autoridades que están en Bogotá.
meaning the authorities centered in Bogota.
Con las autoridades que son locales, están controladas.
As to the local authorities, they're under control.
They're what?
They are under control.
And what do you mean by
Cuando
that?
dice que están controladas, ¿qué quiere
Hay
decir?
pagas.
Paid off.
Y
And
en el caso de los asaltantes de
in the case of robbers, bank robbers or robbers,
esos son los que realmente tienen mayor riesgo.
they are the ones that really constitute a risk.
Those are that would steal the shipment.
Es los que le van a robar el cargamento. Ajá.
Por el dinero.
For the money.
Now, you said the local authorities are
Y
paid off.
dice
What
usted
local
que
authorities are you
las
referring to?
autoridades locales ya están pagas. ¿A qué autoridades está usted refiriendo?
Generalmente el jefe de la policía.
Generally, the chief of police,
Are you speaking of
¿Está
Colombia?
usted hablando de Colombia?
Sí.
Yes, of course.
Okay. Now, New York City,
Ahora,
let's look in that area.
Vamos a hablar de la ciudad de Nueva York. Ajá.
Where's your greatest concern there?
¿Cuál es la preocupación máxima en la ciudad?
La preocupación máxima de la ciudad
The greatest concern in the city
son los robos.
are the robberies also.
Okay. Now, you talked about, I think your boss was worth $10 to $20 million.
Dijo que su jefe tenía 20, 30 millones.
Obviously, there's a lot of resources in the war against drugs with the cartel. How would you compare the resources, the tools, the weaponry of the cartel versus that of law enforcement?
Yo pienso
Ah,
que hay una,
I
hay una
believe
relativa desventaja
there is a certain disadvantage
en relación a la guerra contra las drogas,
on the side of the war against drugs,
debido a que
because
estos grupos realmente
these groups
son muchos
are really many
y desconocidos.
and unknown.
Además, por ejemplo, el sistema,
Further,
esta organización que se colocó acá,
This organization that was charted here
se colocó para conocimiento,
was set up for information.
porque realmente
Because
ellos no pensaron en organizarla de
They
esa manera.
really never figured that they would organize it in this way.
Esto es después de un análisis
This,
de las cosas que
this
hacen.
comes about after analyzing what their activities have been
Y lo que ellos siempre tratan
and
es
what they always try to do
de actuar separadamente.
is to conduct their activities separately.
Y con el dinero que
And
no solamente a Alberto o Carlos
With
tienen,
the money that not just Alberto or Carlos could have available,
ellos consiguen
they
muchísimas maneras de
get
evadir
a lot, they find a lot of ways to avoid
las leyes y las autoridades.
the authorities and the laws.
My time has expired. I
Se me
hope,
acabó
Mr. Chairman,
mi
to be
tiempo.
able to ask some questions down the road.
We'll be glad to do that. I was going to recognize Mr. Conyers, but he is apparently not here at the moment. Mr. Geekus, you're recognized for 10 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bienvenido, señor Rodríguez.
Thank you.
Yo prefiero preguntarle usando el español, pero
Would rather
se me
use
olvidó
Spanish,
todo.
But I think I will not.
The first question that I wanted to ask was, my apologies. I said that I would prefer to ask questions in Spanish, but nobody would understand me, and I've forgotten it anyway. So, after you were arrested,
Después de su arresto,
did someone take your place as deputy to Carlos?
llenó su puesto como el ayudante de Carlos.
Realmente desconozco lo que haya
I
podido
really
suceder
do not
después
know
de-
what might have happened after I was.
What is your best estimate?
Pero, ¿qué cree usted?
Mi imaginación dará que seguramente que Carlos lo
I
manejará
figure
lo
that
manejará con alguna otra persona.
Carlos will maintain the control through somebody else.
So that
O sea,
so that the organization of which you were a part is still functioning,
de la que formó usted sigue en operación.
Posiblemente.
Possibly.
you don't know for sure.
¿No sabe usted a ciencia cierta?
No lo sé.
No, I do not know for sure.
In your cooperation with the law enforcement officers, were you not able to describe the existing organization?
Describir la organización como existía?
Sí, claro que sí.
Yes, of course I did.
Pero,
As of
But
yes, go ahead.
pero realmente
But-
ellos son, como le comentaba antes, como
as I
comentaba en
mentioned
el-
before,
tratan de actuar
they
de forma fantasmal, ¿no? De forma-
try to act in a underplayed way or as ghosts, as it were.
But it is reasonable to understand
Pero sería
that the,
razonable
to
entender,
assume that the
suponer,
activities are still being pursued.
actividades, siguen efectuando.
Seguramente que sí.
Surely they are.
Isn't it true that the renowned chief of operations for many years was out of Colombia was Pablo Escobar? Isn't that correct?
De la droga era Pablo Escobar.
Que no es-
Excuse me?
In the historical sense, one of the notorious leaders of the Colombian cartels,
Muy renombrado
perhaps the leader at one time, was Pablo Escobar. Isn't that correct?
Pablo Escobar.
Cierto. Sí,
That
And-
is true, yes.
And he perished, did
Y
he
él
not?
falleció, ¿no es cierto?
correcto.
That is correct.
Someone or some group of people then took over his place. Is that correct?
Un grupo de personas tiene que haber tomado el puesto que tenía él.
Yo creo que todo
I-
eso se atomizó.
I believe that sort of spread out.
y
So
se-
that leadership,
O sea que la jefatura
se perdió.
is lost,
say that again, please,
is lost. The leadership is lost.
is lost.
Se ha perdido.
Se ha perdido.
It is lost.
But you state in your
Sin embargo,
statement
en su-
that there is a federation,
Dice usted que existe una federación. That, I agree.
so you have 4 or 5
O sea
chiefs
que ahora son 4 o 5
rather than
jefes en lugar de
rather than
tener
just one, as Pablo
uno
Escobar
solo
was.
como lo era Pablo Escobar.
Is that correct?
I agree.
Is it reasonable for us to assume that if one of those
Que
leaders of one of the groups in the Federation perished or was removed from the scene, that somebody would take his place?
una vez que se desaparece o lo desaparecen, viene otro a tomar su puesto.
En esos pequeños grupos
In those small groups,
es posible. Claro.
it is possible, of course.
Yeah, the point that I'm trying to drive home here is that the thriving force for the continuation of these cartels is the profit that is made in the United States. Isn't that correct?
Estos grupos son las riquezas que vienen de los Estados Unidos.
Sí, claro.
Yes, of course.
So that you do not see any reduction of activity so long as profit can be made. Is that correct? So would he, as a reasonable man, deduce from all of this that the demand for the drugs that exist in the United States has to be reduced before these activities can be reduced?
Antes de que las actividades de ellos sean reducidas.
Claro,
Of course.
Si es de esa manera,
If
no hay incentivos para
that
traer-
way, there would be no incentive
para
to
traer-
bring in merchandise.
I have no further questions.
No tengo más.
Thank you, Mr. Geekus. I'm going to yield myself another round of questions, and should anyone else wish to, we'll come back as well, Mr. Rodriguez, because we only have a limited number of members present today, being this is a week in which we have a period of recess for Congress. Do you believe, Mr. Rodriguez, that the Caribbean's become an increasingly popular route as compared to Mexico for the transportation of drugs from Colombia to the United States?
De acuerdo con las conversaciones con
According
Alberto
to conversations I had with Alberto
y Carlos,
and Carlos,
ellos,
What is your
they, excuse me,
Oh, certainly, go ahead.
ellos afirman que la ruta más popular
they have stated that the most popular route
que es el Caribe en este momento,
is the Caribbean at this time,
o sea, 3 años atrás, 2 años atrás.
meaning at this time 3 years ago.
I understand you've been in prison 3 years, so I understand this is 3 years ago. What's your perception of the importance and significance of Puerto Rico in this trafficking corridor, or what was it in 3 years ago?
Es cuál o cuál era hace 3 años.
Era bien importante.
It was quite important.
And what's your perception about the effectiveness, or was the effectiveness, of U.S. drug interdiction efforts in the Caribbean?
Fuerzas de intercepción en el Caribe.
De acuerdo a lo último que he escuchado,
According to the last I heard,
los radares que han puesto
the radar that has been set up
y las actividades que desarrollan
and the activities conducted
por las autoridades
by
de Estados Unidos,
the enforcement agencies of the United States,
se ha reducido un poco el paso a través de Puerto
the
Rico. O sea,
transit through Puerto Rico has somewhat diminished.
pero
but-
continúa.
It persists.
Now, you've indicated that you have been out of the circuit, so to speak, for about 3 years, but you've had some information coming to you more recently than 3 years ago, I understand. Is that correct? In other words, some of the things you've heard and been able to pick up have been more current than 3 years ago, right?
Más actualizado. That is correct.
What about the perception you have of the drug interdiction efforts of the United States with regard to Mexico? Do you have any knowledge or perception of that?
El tráfico también entiendo de acuerdo a la percepción que tengo es que el
My
tráfico se ha
perception and my information is that the traffic has been reduced.
Is there corruption in Mexico caused by the drug trade?
¿Corrupción en México con relación al tráfico de drogas?
De acuerdo a lo que he escuchado,
From what I have
bastante.
heard, quite a bit.
You have indicated that citizens of the Dominican Republic have been involved in New York City with respect to the trafficking you did there. Maybe they're not citizens of the Dominican Republic. Maybe they're now Americans, but from the Dominican. But at any rate, they're Dominicans involved. Can you describe that a little bit for me? Is this common, and just mainly used Dominicans in drug trafficking in New York?
En cuanto al tráfico en Nueva York de los dominicanos.
Normalmente los dominicanos son los distribuidores.
Generally, Dominicans do the distribution.
Ellos, de acuerdo a las explicaciones, a las historias que
According
me ha que
to
Carlos me comentó,
the comments Carlos made to me,
lo que pasó con los dominicanos es que crecieron en
what
el negocio con los
happened
colombianos.
with the Dominicans is that they grew within the business at the same time as the Colombians.
Ellos como distribuidores y los
Dominicans as distributors
y los
and
colombianos
Colombians as
mayoristas.
wholesalers.
Y por lo tanto hay
And
una estrecha relación entre los dos
therefore,
grupos.
there is a close relationship between both groups.
Could you elaborate on the average quantity of cocaine being moved into New York City on a weekly and a monthly basis by your branch?
Nueva York en una semana por su conjunto.
No, realmente no lo sabría.
I really would not know that.
You did not know what it was 3 years ago when you were working there?
La cantidad de hace 3 años, ¿qué volumen moverían?
Todo Nueva York.
All
decir,
of
todos
New
los-
York,
todos los
you mean
grupos.
all the groups?
Well, no, of what
No, no.
your cartel
Okay.
moved. What did you move? What did Carlos move? How much quantity on a weekly or monthly basis did your group, just your group?
Nada más el suyo. Oh, okay.
Yo pienso que
I
aproximadamente
believe that
50, 100.
approximately 50, 100 kilos
A week?
por semana.
En algún, eso
At
podría ser
some-
un promedio de un
That
mes posiblemente.
would be an average for a month, possibly.
For a month. And that means that for a year, you might have moved 1,000, 1,200 kilos or more?
Movería que 1,200, 2,000 kilos, ¿cuánto?
Posiblemente sí, claro.
Possibly, yes, of course.
Do you have any way of estimating the total amount moved by Colombian cartels in the New York City area in a month or a year?
De calcular cuánto moverían todos los carteles en la ciudad de Nueva York.
Realmente es muy difícil.
That would really be very difficult.
With regard to your group again, your branch, Carlos's operation, How did the Dominicans get paid who were distributing the drugs? How do they make their money?
¿Cómo ganan ellos su plata?
O sea, lo que los
We-
grupos colombianos le
And
entregan la mercancía
the
a
Colombian
ellos a un
groups
precio de
supplied
mayorista.
them at a wholesaler's price.
Ellos
And
mezclan la droga
Cut the drugs
y forman de un
and
kilo posiblemente
out of
2 o 3
1
kilos.
kilo, they make possibly 2 or 3 kilos.
Luego ellos
They
es el
then,
entendido que tengo realmente, no desconozco un poco,
this is my understanding. I really do not have direct knowledge of this.
pero después lo dividen,
But
para los distribuidores
After
callejeros.
that, they split it for the street dealers,
O por lo que ellos llaman puntos.
or they put it in what they call spots.
Y allí es donde distribuyen esas,
And
la droga.
it
ya
is in the
a
spots
menor escala.
that they distribute the drugs at a lower volume.
It's my understanding that, and I just want to know if this is correct, that
Quiero saber si
these drugs would come into the United States in various means that you've described in your testimony, that Carlos would arrange, and they'd come to New York City, and then when they were in New York City, then they would be sold wholesale to these Dominicans by Carlos and your group. Is that what happened to the drugs? Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. Now, if we're looking at New York in particular, could you tell us about these so-called spy shops and the trade that you did to avoid the detection by law enforcement officers? What kind of equipment was used, and what is a spy shop anyway?
Es un almacén donde se
This is a store
venden aparatos
where
para detectar radares,
devices are sold for the detection of radar,
comunicaciones telefónicas,
uh, telephone communications,
micrófonos escondidos.
hidden microphones.
Y estos almacenes existen
And
legalmente.
these stores operate legally.
So they're all over New York City. There are several of them.
Están por todo Nueva York,
Sí,
son
están
varios.
en los
Yes.
directorios telefónicos
They are in the telephone books
o anunciados en los periódicos.
and they are advertised in newspapers.
Well, is that how would you get a clone phone? How would you get a phone that was
¿Cómo logra
cloned?
usted, un teléfono gemelo?
Un teléfono gemelo
A clone phone
se logra
can be obtained
preguntando en algunos sitios como las cabinas
by
telefónicas,
inquiring in various places, like, for example, the telephone arcades,
donde ellos tienen información sobre
Who
los peruanos
have information about the Peruvians.
y ellos
And
lo conectan a uno
They put you in touch
con ellos, con los
with
peruanos,
them, with the Peruvians,
y se ejecuta el negocio.
and the transaction is carried out.
Do you know how the Peruvians came to
¿Y sabe
get
cómo
involved
los
as the
peruanos
primary
cómo se metieron
suppliers
en
of clone
esta
phones in New York?
fase del negocio de teléfonos gemelos?
Realmente no lo sé, yo pienso
I
que-
really don't know.
I've taken up another 10-minute round, so I'm going to yield to Mr. Hutchinson, and he may have another one too if you'd like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to ask just a few more questions. Mr. Rodriguez, you talked about the 50 to 100 kilos of cocaine that came in through your branch each month into New York City. What was your distribution network? Was it all in New York City, or did any of it go out into outlying territory?
Carlos operaba directamente aquí en Nueva York
Carlos operated directly here in New York,
y sus clientes son más que
and
todo en Nueva
his
York.
customers mostly were in New York City.
Algunos clientes
There were certain customers
le comentaban a él
who talked to him
que de otras ciudades como
and
Boston
told him that people were coming from cities like Boston,
Chicago
Chicago,
y tal vez Filadelfia.
and perhaps Philadelphia.
Eh,
So buyers
O sea que compradores
could come from other cities into
venían de otras
Carlos's
ciudades
network and be a customer.
hablar,
Yes.
hablar con los clientes de Carlos.
to talk to Carlos's customers.
Y ellos
Now-
eran los
And
encargados de
the-
entregarles
these
el droga.
customers would then be in charge of delivering drugs to those other people.
And so Carlos's customers were wholesalers themselves and not users.
Exacto.
Exactly.
How far down the chain would a user be? Are you a couple of dealers away?
I'm sorry, Congressman, I did not get your question.
Well, that's sort of a country saying I had. You know, how far down the chain would the user be from Carlos's operation?
Usuario, el que usa la droga, ¿a qué distancia y con cuántos niveles de separación estaría de Carlos?
Como unos cuatro
About
niveles, 5 niveles.
4, 5 levels away?
And so the ultimate user could be
O sea que
virtually anywhere in the United States of the cocaine that came into New York.
podría ser cualquier persona la que usa esa droga que entra a los Estados Unidos.
Claro.
Sure.
Now, I ask you to
Ahora,
talk about the resources between law enforcement and the cartel.
la comparación entre
From your perspective, what was the greatest tool or weapon
cuál era la
that law enforcement has against
más poderosa
drug trafficking?
que tenemos en contra de la droga.
La extradición.
Extradition.
Extradition. In other words, if they caught you in Colombia, they could bring you back here to the United
Si
States.
te agarran en Colombia, podrían traerte a los Estados Unidos.
De acuerdo. Ese es el
That
arma
is
que
correct.
You
realmente-
fear
That is the real weapon, el arma,
que tienen los Estados Unidos
that the United States can wield
para contra la
Obviously, you fear
to, sorry,
that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
in the war against drugs.
You fear the jails in the United States much more than prison in Colombia.
Las cárceles de los Estados Unidos mucho más que permanecer en Colombia.
las leyes.
The laws, it's the laws.
No ta-
It's-
la cárcel obviamente también, pero las leyes
Jail as well, of course, but it's the laws
son más estrictas
that are much more strict.
y no hay
And-
posibilidades de arreglos.
There is no way of fixing it up
Como se hace en Colombia con
as
con
you
las
can do
autoridades
in Colombia
que son pagas.
with the authorities that are being paid off.
This is not a question, this is just a comment here. I think what you're saying is it's the integrity of our system of law in the United States that is our greatest tool, and we can never let that be attacked or undermined. From a drug dealer's perspective, do you see any difference between being prosecuted in state court versus federal court? The federal sentences versus the state sentences.
O la federal, ¿hay diferencia en las condenas estatales o federales?
Yo no he estado en una prisión estatal, pero lo que es
I have not been in a state jail, but from what I have heard
en la prisión donde estoy,
at the jail where I'm lodged,
las leyes federales son
the,
más estrictas.
the federal laws are much stricter.
I'm just curious as to whether,
Curiosidad.
whenever you're dealing drugs, that you think about the penalties. Do you think about, well, this is 10 years, or this is 20 years, or this could be life in prison, or you just take the risk and go with the flow?
Cadena perpetua o sencillamente dejan correr.
Hay un desconocimiento grande
There is a great lack of knowledge
en lo que es las personas que operan en Nueva York.
among the people who operate in New York City.
Y es poco, naturalmente
And
se le teme a las autoridades.
Naturally, the authorities are feared,
Pero no, realmente no
but
se piensa mucho en esto, tal vez por
actually,
desconocimiento.
you don't give that too much thought, perhaps out of ignorance.
Of the drug dealers that you're aware of, say in the New York City branch, what percent of the workers, employees, dealers are Colombians?
La mayoría, un 90%.
For the most part, I'd say 90%.
En la parte de
As to
wholesaler, ¿no?
the wholesaler group.
And then the Dominicans have their own network there.
Exactly.
Now, I just want to end on this question.
Ahora quiero terminar con esta pregunta.
What advice would you give a young person who is considering doing business with a drug dealer?
Que no, lo que yo haría es decirle que
What I would do
es explicarle
is tell him, explain to him
un caso como el que me sucedió a mí.
something like what happened to me.
Y yo estoy seguro que
And I'm certain
la persona desistiría
that the person would cease and desist
de entrar en tratos con cualquier
as to
clase de droga.
any kind of dealings with any kind of drugs.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hutchinson. Mr. Conyers, you're recognized for 10 minutes.
Congratulations, Chairman McCullum. I think this is another of an important series of hearings on this subject. May I also commend the interpreter. Miss Clancy has been extraordinarily helpful, hasn't she? Thank you, Miss Clancy, for your very skillful interpretations for us here today. Now, we are deeply indebted to Mr. Rodriguez, and we're aware of the sensitivity of his appearance here, and we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that he stays alive and well, and that we cooperate with him in the same way that he's cooperated with us.
Thank you very much.
Wait, where are those two? Oh, here they are. Mr. Rodriguez,
Señor Rodríguez.
how helpful do you think our undercover agents are in fighting the drug problem in the United States and outside of the United States?
Detectar las operaciones dentro y fuera de los Estados Unidos.
Yo pienso que
I believe
los llamados CIs
that what we refer to as
informantes
CIs, the confidential informants,
realmente han surtido un ejemplo,
have really
han surtido
been an
efecto
example and
bien
have
grande,
had a very, very big effect.
debido a que
Because
naturalmente lo que menos uno espera
naturally, the least a person expects is
el compañero o la
that
persona que está
your
haciendo
associate
negocios también,
or the person with whom you're entering into a
y
transaction
que seguramente es del país también,
and who undoubtedly comes from
Del
your
país de
home
origen.
country
esté
is
trabajando
working
para el gobierno de Estados
for
Unidos,
the
o para
United
las
States government or for its agencies.
y por lo tanto
And therefore,
pienso que tanto aquí como
I believe
fuera,
that here as well as abroad,
es algo a lo que realmente en este momento
This
las
is
organizaciones temen,
something that at this time the organizations really fear
temen con bastante intensidad.
quite a bit, I must say.
In the opinion of Mr. Rodriguez, are our law enforcement people getting better, or are they about the same as they've always been?
Yo pienso que han aprendido
I
muchísimo
believe
más,
they have learned a great deal.
han aprendido
And
más del negocio, ¿verdad?
They have become more familiar with the type of business.
Debido a que estas organizaciones son muy
Since
cambiantes,
these organizations are constantly in a state of flux,
precisamente tratando de camuflarse, ¿no?
actually trying to camouflage themselves.
Y las
And
autoridades han logrado
the authorities have managed
establecer los
to
mecanismos,
determine what the mechanisms
para detectar
are
estos tipos
that
de camuflajes, ¿no?
could detect the new camouflage.
Is it getting more difficult to spot an undercover agent that is working with the government against the drug business people?
Sí, realmente,
Yes,
porque normalmente
it really
son personas
has,
que han
because
estado muchos años dentro del negocio.
generally it is people who have been part of the business for a long time.
Y no se
And
desconfía de ellos.
you don't mistrust them.
Now, looking at this from our point of view, we make lots of arrests at the street level throughout America. We lock up in the course of a week 2,000 or 3,000 people. The next night, 2,000 or 3,000 more people are there to take their place. So we have a lot of people going to court, getting trials, getting sentenced, getting put in prison. But at the street level, there's always somebody to take their place, no matter what part of the country, in New York, in California, Texas, Florida, it doesn't matter. Could you speak to this problem from your point of view, please?
Siempre hay mucha gente esperando
There are always many people
poder participar en
waiting
estos negocios.
to be able to take part in these type of businesses.
Y entonces lo que sucede
And so what happens
es que
is
una vez que
that
algunos son retirados de la calle,
once certain people are retired from the street,
hay un grupo de gente esperando
there
para
is
entrar.
a group that is waiting to come in
Debido a la facilidad, digamos, a la
because
relativa
of
facilidad
the ease or the relative ease
para conseguir dinero y
to
para poder realmente muchas veces
get money and
apenas muchas veces para poder vivir, ni siquiera para
often
hacer dinero.
to be able to make a living, not even to become wealthy.
Y yo pienso que esa es la razón principal.
And
Mucha
I
gente
believe that that
piensa
is the main reason. I think many people believe
que esto es un gran negocio y que
that
con eso
this
se puede
is
hacer mucho dinero.
a great type of business and that you can make a lot of money in it.
Suppose Mr. McCullum and Mr. Conyers Mr. Hutchinson were able to persuade the people that lead the fight against drugs in America at the national and international level to start going straight to the top rather than sweeping the streets at the bottom all the time.
Sería mucho más efectivo.
It would be much more effective.
Sería mucho más efectivo.
It would be
debido a
much
que-
more effective.
Porque pararía
Because
el flujo.
it would stop the flow.
Lo único que yo
The
vería
only
nuevamente,
thing that I would consider
¿no? Seguramente los grupos
is
empezarían
that undoubtedly
a cambiar de sistema.
the groups would begin changing their MOs.
De acuerdo a lo que tengo entendido,
From what I understand,
ya hay algunos dominicanos recibiendo
there are
directamente
already some Dominicans who are receiving directly
desde Colombia.
from Colombia,
Cuando a ellos no se les consideraba antes
when previously they had not been considered
como wholesalers.
as wholesalers.
Thank you for that information. Who's bigger than Medellin?
Cali fue más grande que Medellín,
Cali was bigger than Medellin,
pero yo pienso
but
que Cali está,
I believe,
de acuerdo a lo que he leído, de acuerdo a los
from what I
comentarios que he
have
escuchado,
read and from comments I have heard,
Cali está también
that
volviéndose un
Cali
estilo federación,
is also becoming a sort of federation.
y muchos grupos se están
And
organizando
there are many groups that are getting organized
debido a que tienen pues poder económico,
because they have the financial power.
y los Rodríguez han
And
perdido,
the Rodriguezes
han perdido
have
fuerza.
lost their power.
Could we count on, well, how much could we frankly count on the Colombian government to help us if we went to the top to take out Cali and Medellin?
Es una apreciación personal también.
This is also my personal opinion, Congressman.
Yo pienso que
I believe
con la elección de
that
un presidente honesto,
were an honest president elected,
y teniendo en cuenta las autoridades que
And
en este momento están, yo pienso que son
bearing in mind
bastante estrictas y
the
eficientes,
law enforcements, which at this time I believe to be very honest and effective.
especialmente centralmente hablando.
In particular, well, talking of the centralized government,
Yo pienso que
I believe
se podría contar realmente con una
that
fuerza bastante grande.
you could count really on a big force there.
We could, but can we?
Podríamos, pero podemos.
Realmente yo pienso que en este momento
I really believe that
hay
at this
un momento de
time,
transición
this is a transitional period,
en el cual tal vez el
And
presidente Samper
perhaps President Samper
recibió el agua sucia de
Um,
muchos años,
was swamped in the filthy water accumulated over many years.
pero que
But
tanto el país
the country,
como las fuerzas exteriores que lo
as
presionan,
well as the external forces that press into it,
como la desertificación,
For example, the desertification
van a hacer que realmente el país
will
corrija sus rumbos.
really make the country correct its ways.
By unanimous consent, Mr. Conyers, you can have another 5 minutes. You were not here for the second round or the first round, so we're going to combine your time here a little bit and just keep
Thanks.
going if you wish.
Thank you, Chairman McCullough. Now, the cartel pays law enforcement people in Colombia.
De acuerdo que he escuchado, sí.
From what I have heard, that is correct.
Do they do that in New York?
Y lo hacen al igual en Nueva York.
No, en Nueva York no se pagan autoridades.
No, law enforcement is not paid off in New York.
Who is?
¿A quién le pagan?
A estos pequeños contratistas, digamos, a estos
Small
contratistas
contractors, these little contractors
que consiguen cosas
who
rutinarias,
can get you everyday things
como carros,
like cars and
licencias, ese tipo de cosas.
driver's licenses and that type of thing.
How much drugs do the police take from you or your people from time to time?
¿Cuánta droga les quita la policía a usted o a sus grupos? De vez en cuando.
De acuerdo a lo que he escuchado,
From what I have heard,
yo diría como,
I would say
como un 20-30%.
about 20-30%.
del total.
It's hard to
Of the
tell,
total.
isn't it? It's hard to tell, isn't it? Because what gets seized and what gets turned in, you may not ever know.
Lo que se incautúa y lo que verdaderamente se entrega en la central, usted jamás podría saber.
Sí, no lo sé.
Yes, I do not know that.
We're talking about New York,
Estamos hablando de la ciudad de Nueva York,
right?
¿verdad? That is correct.
Okay. Well, let's turn this over a little bit and look at it from another angle.
A un distinto punto de vista.
Let's go after the launderers of money.
Vemos ahora a los que lavan el dinero.
If there were no launderers, there could hardly even be a business.
Si hubiera gente que lava el dinero, no habría negocios que hacer.
Sí, seguramente que sí.
Undoubtedly so.
Habría algún otro mecanismo, ¿no?
But there would be some other system.
Undoubtedly so.
Seguramente que sí.
Now, the problem that we run, excuse me, go ahead.
No, I was translating your statement.
The problem that we run into, of course, when we look at the money, is that many of the people that handle the money don't handle the drugs. Is that right?
No manejan la droga, correcto.
Correcto.
That is correct.
So we may have perfectly legitimate business people
Tener comerciantes
handling the money that have no contact, as far as we know, whatsoever with the drugs.
sin contacto ninguno, según nos pudiéramos dar cuenta con la droga.
De acuerdo, es así.
I agree, that is correct.
Now me and Mr. McCullum and Mr. Hutchinson are now talking with our leaders about money laundering.
Con relación al lavado de dinero.
So, where would you recommend we start?
¿Recomendaría usted que empecé la labor?
Yo creo que ya empezaron la labor. Y
I believe you have already started.
han reducido el nivel, por ejemplo, de remesas.
For example, the wire transfers has been reduced greatly.
El monto de también
I mean the sum being transferred.
se están chequeando más las transacciones con los bancos.
Also, banking transactions are being more closely supervised.
Como son la compra de
For example,
money
the
orders,
purchase of money orders.
también los envíos
Also,
de mercancías,
the shipment of merchandise.
mercancía legal,
I mean, legal goods
están siendo revisadas en las aduanas.
are being checked more thoroughly at the customs services.
Y ha dificultado y en
And
este momento
it has
de
made
acuerdo a
it
lo que he
difficult,
escuchado,
from what I have heard,
están dificultando
it's
enormemente
becoming very difficult
mandar ese dinero a Colombia.
to send the money back to Colombia.
En este momento,
Right now,
de acuerdo a lo que tengo entendido,
from what I understand,
el dinero se está regresando en
the
efectivo,
money is being sent down in cash,
volviendo a seguramente los mecanismos que tenían
going
anteriormente.
back undoubtedly to systems that they have used previously.
Y están tratando de dejar a
And
un lado los mecanismos
They
sofisticados.
have tried to put aside the very sophisticated systems they used.
Well, now, even me and you, Mr. Rodriguez, know that there are offshore banks in the islands. There are banks in Europe that couldn't stay in business a week if they weren't handling drug money. What about them?
Realmente
Actually,
un poquito difícil
It's a little bit difficult
dar una recomendación
to make a
en
recommendation.
este momento acerca de esto, como son la compra de
For example,
money orders,
the purchase of money orders.
también los envíos
Also,
de mercancías,
the shipment of merchandise.
mercancía legal,
I mean, legal goods
están siendo revisadas en las aduanas.
are being checked more thoroughly at the customs services.
Y ha dificultado y en
And
este momento
it has
de
made
acuerdo a
it
lo que he
difficult,
escuchado,
from what I have heard,
están dificultando
it's
enormemente
becoming very difficult
mandar ese dinero a Colombia.
to send the money back to Colombia.
En este momento,
Right now,
de acuerdo a lo que tengo entendido,
from what I understand,
el dinero se está regresando en
the
efectivo,
money is being sent down in cash,
volviendo a seguramente los mecanismos que tenían
going
anteriormente.
back undoubtedly to systems that they have used previously.
Y están tratando de dejar a
And
un lado los mecanismos
They
sofisticados.
have tried to put aside the very sophisticated systems they used.
Well, now, even me and you, Mr. Rodriguez, know that there are offshore banks in the islands. There are banks in Europe that couldn't stay in business a week if they weren't handling drug money. What about them?
Realmente
Actually,
un poquito difícil
It's a little bit difficult
dar una recomendación
to make a
en
recommendation
este momento acerca de esto,
in that regard right now,
debido a que desconozco
because I'm
los mecanismos,
really
los
not
nuevos
aware
mecanismos
of the new systems
que ellos están usando
that they are using
con estos bancos.
in these banks.
Anteriormente,
Previously,
Esto se hacía
This was
con, pagando
carried
servicios y
out
facturas
by paying services and invoices
inexistentes
that didn't exist,
o
or
pagando a corporaciones
by paying corporations
en el exterior
abroad
por actividades que nunca se
for activities that had never been rendered.
Asimismo, se
Also,
compraban, se compraban algunos aparatos, por ejemplo,
Certain appliances were being purchased, for example,
como aparatos para perforación petrolera,
oil drilling equipment,
los cuales por su tipo de
which,
por el tipo
because
de legislación, de leyes que tienen para sus movimientos,
the laws that control their movements
tenían facilidad para comprarse 10,
They
20 y 30 veces,
could be bought 10, 30 times
cuando
over,
solamente existía una
when
transacción.
actually only one transaction had really taken place.
Thank you very much for talking with me, Mr. Rodriguez.
Conmigo, señor Rodríguez.
And thank you very much, Mr. Conyers. I'm going to have a couple of wrap-up questions here and maybe some burning hole questions others have, but we're going to pretty much conclude this hearing in the next 10 or 15 minutes, Mr. Rodriguez. You've been very patient. Could you describe for us, Mr. Rodriguez, the relationship between Alberto, the head of the whole cartel down in Colombia, and the people who are responsible for the cultivation and production of cocaine?
Realmente la mayoría las compras normalmente
Actually,
las compras normalmente las hacía Alberto.
generally, the purchases were made by Alberto.
Alberto
Alberto
encarga por encargo
places an order
a los diferentes grupos que manejan los laboratorios
with the various groups that handle the laboratories.
y ellos producen la mercancía
They
que ese grupo necesita.
process then the merchandise that that particular group requires.
Esta información la tengo
I have this information
a través de Carlos, ¿no?
from Carlos again.
And once those products have been purchased and the order has been filled, presumably he then makes the transactions that you described earlier to transport the finished product to the United States. He did not do any cultivation. Alberto didn't do any cultivation himself. He didn't run a laboratory himself then. Is that right?
No, he does not,
Que yo sepa.
to my knowledge at least.
Okay. Now, I understand that Colombia has moved into a global heroin market, and much of this has probably occurred subsequent to your arrest, but can you comment on anything that you know or have heard about the price and the purity of Colombian heroin?
Calidad del producto de Colombia al respecto.
Yo nunca tuve experiencia con
I
la
had
heroína,
no experience with heroin,
pero
but
he escuchado y
I
leído
have heard and I have read
acerca de
a great
acerca de
deal
la heroína en Colombia.
about heroin in Colombia.
Y también he tenido
And I
algunas
have
conversaciones
also had certain conversations
en la prisión
in jail
con personas que
with
están dentro de este negocio.
the people who are involved in that type of business.
Según entiendo,
From my understanding,
la calidad de la heroína colombiana
the
no es
quality of Colombian heroin is not good.
buena. Hay una ventaja aparente
There is an apparent advantage
de que un kilo vale
in that
aproximadamente
1 kilo is worth approximately,
por $100,000 lo venden
they would even sell it for $100,000.
en en Nueva York,
in New York,
es lo que equivaldría aproximadamente a 5 de cocaína.
which is the equivalent of approximately 5 kilos of cocaine.
Lo que aparentaría ser mejor
So
transportar
it would seem a better deal to transport
heroína que cocaína.
heroin instead of cocaine.
That certainly makes sense.
Eso parece muy lógico.
Pero entiendo
But
también
my understanding further is
que el transporte es muy delicado de
that
este tipo de
the
productos.
transportation for this type of product is a very delicate matter.
No puede ser transportado
It
igual que la cocaína.
cannot be transported in the same way as cocaine is transported.
Debido a
Because
los calores, a los golpes,
heat affects it, rough handling affects it.
la luz creo que lo afecta.
I believe light affects it.
Esas son, digamos, unas circunstancias generales. ¿no?
These are general circumstances of it.
Entiendo que los dominicanos
I also understand that the Dominicans
no están involucrados
are not involved
en este negocio.
in this
en
type of
cantidad.
business in large quantities.
Y la red general de
And
distribución de
the
los colombianos
general network for distribution of the Colombians
son los dominicanos.
are Dominicans.
Y
And so
también se sabe
it is also known
de que la mayoría de los distribuidores
that
son la gente negra
most of the distributors are the Afro-Americans
y los puertorriqueños.
and Puerto Ricans.
Y no están dentro de la red digamos, de los
And
colombianos.
they are not within the scope, let's say, of the Colombians.
Digamos, eso es en general
This is
lo que he
speaking
escuchado, lo que he leído.
generally of what I
Resumiendo.
have heard and read and summarized for you.
Well, I appreciate your doing that. You certainly have access to information and sources even now that we don't have, and so it's helpful to the committee, even though you did not deal in heroin yourself. A few minutes ago, you responded to Mr. Conyers' questions in asking you about the police taking a cut or a percentage or some portion of the drugs, of the cocaine coming to the United States with a 20 to 30% figure. I would like you to clarify that. I'm confused. Is this 20 to 30% that our law enforcement interdicts, takes away because they're capturing the drugs or stopping the shipments? Or is this 20 or 30% bribery or payoff money in Colombia? Or is it bribery or payoff money in New York City? Just being done in the form of drugs instead of money. What do you mean by the 20 to 30% being taken by law enforcement?
Yo tal vez entendí erróneamente la
Perhaps
pregunta,
I misunderstood the question,
la anterior.
this previous question.
Yo cuando hablé del 20 o 30%,
When I referred to the 20 or 30%,
hablé de lo que la
I was
policía incauta a
referring
un grupo del total de lo que
to
introduce a los Estados
what
Unidos.
the police seizes from one group from what it brings into the United States.
Pero no tengo conocimiento
But I have no information
de que la policía
that the police
digamos tomado droga
has, let's
y no
say,
reportada.
taken, seized drugs that are then not vouchered.
In other words, he has no information. They're using it for their own purposes, or selling it, reselling it or something.
No, en las
No evidence
No,
of corruption.
in the conversations that I have had, I do not know that.
No evidence of any corruption in this regard.
realmente no.
I don't really.
Okay. I appreciate your clarifying that. I just got one or two more about New York City, and then I'm complete with this. I've heard you talk about warehouses, And I assume from your testimony these are apartments where drugs would be stored for a while after they came to New York City. I'm curious to know how often, well, first of all, how were such apartments or warehouses selected by your group, and how often did the locations need to be moved for storing these drugs?
Generalmente son edificios
Generally, these are buildings
de familias,
where families live, family residences,
donde una persona puede
where
vivir
somebody can live
y realizar sus
and
labores sin
carry
llamar la
out
atención.
their tasks without calling too much attention to themselves.
Realmente no tienen como un término de vencimiento.
There is really no specific expiration date, as it were.
Pero en el caso
But
de la sucursal manejada por
in
Carlos,
the case of this branch that was handled by Carlos,
Carlos tomaba la decisión de
Carlos
acuerdo a su intuición.
made the decisions according to his intuition.
Porque como mencioné,
Because, as I
él era un hombre
said before,
de inteligencia militar
he had come from military intelligence, and
y tenía algunos movimientos y algunas decisiones
he
que no las comentaba,
made some
simplemente las-
decisions and took some actions that he did not share
compartía con nadie.
with anybody.
Can you comment on young people under the age of 18 doing street-level trafficking in drugs in New York?
Sí, ¿puedo comentar?
You're asking me if I can comment?
Yes, if you can give us a view. Is this common? Did you observe it? Have you heard about it? Is it an everyday thing or not?
Yo he visto en Queens
I have seen in Queens
muchos muchachos jóvenes
many young men
en las esquinas, sobre todo en la calle llamada Roosevelt,
standing on the corners, particularly on a street called Roosevelt,
y también en algunas zonas
And
como en el Village.
also in other areas like the Village.
Y
And
efectivamente creo que ahí están bastante
in
hay
fact,
bastante gente trabajando
I do believe there is quite a large group of people,
joven, pues gente joven,
young people,
trabajando en esta
working
distribución.
in the distribution of this type.
No, nuevamente repito,
And
hablando 3 años.
again, I must state that this was 3 years ago.
No, I understand.
Entendí.
I appreciate that. In terms of how debt would be collected from one of your clients, could you elaborate on what would be done if somebody failed to pay Carlos or didn't come through with his end of the deal?
No cumple con una obligación.
Generalmente sería un dominicano.
Generally, it would be a Dominican we're talking about, right?
I understand.
Entendido. Okay.
Normalmente él hablaría con
The
con Alberto,
usual thing would be that he would speak to Alberto,
¿cierto? Y con la persona, y
And
con Hernando.
to Hernando.
Y ellos harían un contacto,
They, in turn, would
en Colombia
make contact in Colombia
sobre el problema.
Regarding this problem.
Ellos contratarían
They
estos cobradores
would hire the collectors
al representante de Colombia que tiene el grupo en Nueva York.
In other words, they would contact the representative of the group in New York who is in Colombia.
Okay. Y
Okay.
Entonces el grupo
And
haría
then
contacto, le darían
the
el
group
mecanismo de
would
contacto
be
a Carlos.
given, Carlos would be given the way in which he could contact that group.
Y hablaría con ellos sobre el problema.
Carlos.
Carlos.
Carlos would then speak to them about the problem,
Ya en Nueva York.
once in New York already.
Y seguramente irían a hablar con los
And undoubtedly,
irían a hablar con los
they
personas dominicanas
would then
y
go
exigir los pagos, ¿no?
to speak to the Dominicans and demand the payment.
Are these Dominicans in Colombia who were operating as representatives of the Dominicans in New York?
En Colombia representan al grupo de Nueva York. Son dominicanos. No, Colombians.
Colombians. So there would be a contact with the Colombians generally contact with the Dominicans generally in Colombia. In other words, I'm getting confused, and I don't want to confuse you, but let's say we're down in Colombia now. You mentioned that Carlos would go back through Alberto and Hernandez, and there would be some representative in Colombia of the group in New York, you said. I presume you're referring to the Dominicans in New York as the group having a representative in Colombia. Is that true? Did they have a representative there, a Colombian representative in Colombia?
No.
Discúlpeme,
I
también me expresé
apologize.
mal.
Perhaps I did not express myself clearly.
If you could explain it again, I would appreciate it. How would this happen if you wanted to collect on a debt that wasn't being paid by the Colombians? If Carlos wanted to collect, and he talked to Alberto Hernandez about it, how did the negotiation happen, or did somebody threaten somebody, or what?
Carlos habla con Alberto
Carlos speaks to Alberto,
y Alberto delega en Hernando,
and Alberto delegates authority from Hernando
para contactar
on Hernando for Hernando to contact
el representante de los cobradores.
the representative of the collectors.
Ese representante de los cobradores
The
está en
representative
Colombia.
of the collectors is in Colombia.
And this is a Colombian.
Y es
The
colombiano.
collectors are
Colombiano.
representative.
Y los cobradores son colombianos.
Exacto. Entonces,
And the collectors are also Colombian.
él llama,
He calls
o sea, el representante a su grupo en Nueva York.
the representative calls his group in New York,
O sea, los cobradores que están en
the
Nueva York.
collectors that are already in place in New York.
So these collectors in New York are kind of the enforcers. They're going to go out on the street and bang on the door of the Dominicans on behalf of Alberto and Carlos and say, pay me the money or else type of thing. Is that what we're talking about?
Exacto.
Exactly.
So they're professional enforcers or collectors that we're dealing with who are Colombians in New York, but a separate group of people. Is that right?
Un grupo aparte en sí.
Sí,
Yes.
son un grupo aparte.
They are a separate group,
Por eso
Do
le
they,
llamamos
and that's why we call them
contratos.
contractors.
All right. So they're contractors to collect from these people who owed money. And if they weren't successful in getting money, did people get killed?
En obtener el dinero de la deuda,
Sí.
¿qué les sucede? ¿Los matan?
Normalmente es lo que ellos hacen.
Generally, that's what they do.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Well, you've been very, very helpful, Mr. Rodriguez. Mr. Hutchison, do you have any follow-up questions? I'm not looking for another round of questions. I'm just curious if you had any more.
Let me just ask one question, if that's all right. I was thinking of there.
We're ready to wrap this up, but I don't want to belabor it, but I want to let you have the opportunity, Mr. Hutchison.
Mr. Rodriguez, what were the tools of your trade in regard to weapons? To weapons.
En cuanto a armas, ¿qué armas usaba usted en su grupo?
Realmente el grupo no usaba armas.
Actually, my group did not use any weapons.
Creo que
I
Carlos
believe that Carlos
tenía una arma, creo una
did
arma,
have a gun,
pero no la llegué a ver.
but I never actually saw it.
So basically, you or Carlos is high enough in the chain that you didn't need to have high weapons or significant number of weapons, and you utilized enforcers and other people to do that type of work?
Usan a los ejecutores a que las usen libremente.
Esa sería la...
That,
Sí, ese sería el...
that would be the, yes,
el camino.
that would be the way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Carnes, you have a follow-up question?
Yes. Now, Mr. Rodriguez, we've had a very good morning here. If you didn't have weapons, how did you protect the drugs that you were selling?
El secreto
The secret
de mantener
in
la
keeping
seguridad en las warehouses
the warehouses safe
es que nadie conozca
is that nobody should know
dónde se encuentran localizadas.
the location of it.
Y si
And
solamente una persona,
only
posiblemente o dos más,
one person, perhaps two,
conocen esa localización.
would know the location.
Por lo tanto, no,
And therefore,
no es necesario tomar
it's
otras medidas.
not necessary to take any other measures.
Well, how did you
Entonces,
keep possession of all the money that you were handling? Nobody ever took anybody's money in your community?
¿le quita el dinero a nadie en las comunidades?
Más que todo eso sucede al nivel del distribuidor.
Mostly all that happens at the distribution level.
Y los dineros que
And
realmente se tienen
the monies that are
que se tienen en las bodegas
being stored in the warehouses
salen muy rápido, o sea, tienen movimiento rápido
are
hacia
moved out very quickly. They're moved out very quickly
hacia los lavadores de dinero.
to the money launderers.
Y lo mismo la mercancía cuando llega
Same thing with the merchandise. When it arrives,
sale muy rápidamente
it is moved out very quickly
para evitar riesgos.
to avoid these risks.
You mean you never had a shootout in your
¿Está
drug
usted
group?
diciendo que en toda su vida nunca tuvo un tiroteo?
Nobody ever got killed in
Never.
your drug group?
¿En su grupo nunca mataron a nadie?
Que yo sepa, ¿no?
To my
Nobody
knowledge,
ever got beat
none.
up in your drug group?
En su grupo de droga a nadie le pegaron una golpiza.
Nobody ever got kidnapped
A
in your drug
nadie
group?
secuestraron. Yes, my brother.
Well, what did they use? They
Y
had
que
guns.
usaron, tenían armas,
Pero él lo
but
secuestraron
he
en
was
Colombia.
kidnapped in Colombia.
I think
Yo creo
pretty well wrapped up
que el
unless you
señor
got something
Conyers
else.
ya
Just
terminó.
one question.
Una
Thanks, Mr.
pregunta
Chairman.
más.
Okay. Where in the chain of the organization did the African Americans come in?
La organización, la cadena de la organización, ¿en dónde entran los morenos?
A nivel de distribución,
At the distribution level,
What level?
but
pero ellos están relacionados más con los
they are mostly
clientes con los clientes de la organización.
connected with the customers of this organization,
No directamente con la organización.
not directly with the organization.
Did any of them ever
¿Y
work their way up
alguno de ellos
beyond the
logró
distribution level?
ascender más allá del nivel de distribución?
De mi conocimiento, no.
Not to my knowledge, no.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, we want to again thank you, Mr. Rodriguez, for today's hearing. You have been very good to come here today. It's been very constructive and meaningful testimony. And I want to also personally again thank Ms. Clancy for being here. You've done a marvelous job of interpreting. We thank you both. And with that in mind, this hearing is adjourned. If everybody would await in the audience until the witness has retired, it would be appreciated. We do that customarily when we have witnesses of the select nature like this. I should have said that before I recessed the hearing or adjourned it. We thank the audience for your indulgence, and as I said earlier, the hearing is adjourned.
See ya.